Welcome to Signal Ahead. I'm Alfred. Today's briefing, Neuroscience Computational, Sunday, June 28. This is the synthesis above the noise, not the headlines, but the deep currents beneath them. Let's get into it. There's a temptation, when you read the headlines about neuroscience, to imagine the field as a single grand expedition, a march towards some final map of the brain, with each new paper laying down another stretch of road. That picture is comforting and almost entirely wrong. What you find, if you actually sit with a few weeks' worth of computational neuroscience, is something stranger and far more interesting. The field has stopped looking for the road and started studying the principles by which roads make themselves. Let me give you the non-obvious thread, the one a casual reader would miss entirely. Across an astonishing range of these papers, networks of artificial neurons, real spinal motor neurons, brain regions linked by white matter, even communities of abstract agents trading resources, the same idea keeps surfacing, dressed in different mathematics each time. The idea is this: organization is not imposed from above. It emerges locally from the way components interact in time. And the crucial, underappreciated variable is delay, the simple fact that signals take time to travel. Consider the proposal that a component in a complex system survives precisely as long as something else is using its output. No central planner decides which agents matter. A unit that goes unused begins to wander, to explore, to change what it does, and a unit whose output is consumed stays put and stabilizes. From this almost commercial logic, survive by serving functional networks crystallize out of nothing. Now hold that thought against a quite separate finding about excitable neurons connected by excitatory links. You might assume that the delay in signal transmission is a nuisance, an engineering defect to be minimized. Instead, it turns out that delay itself can manufacture self-sustained oscillations and can flip a network abruptly and explosively from disordered firing into tight synchrony with only a whisper of change in connection strength. The lag is not noise around the signal. The lag is part of the computation. This is the cross-cutting insight I want you to carry through the hour. In computational neuroscience right now, time and structure have stopped being separate chapters. We used to ask what a network is wired like, and then, separately, what it does. The newer work refuses that division. It asks how the geometry of connections and the timing of signals jointly give birth to function, and it keeps finding that you cannot understand one without the other. You see it in the study of those reproducible firing cascades, time-locked sequences of spikes, stabilized by the rule that neurons which fire together in the right order strengthen their bond, and held in place by the varied delays along different axons. The surprising result there is that the sheer number of these cascades a network can host is driven, above all, by how clustered its connections are. Tighten the clustering, and you get hundreds of distinct patterns. Randomize the wiring, and the representational capacity collapses by 90%. The structure is not a backdrop. It is the dial that sets how much the network can possibly represent. And in a related vein, there's lovely theoretical work treating myelination, the fatty insulation that sets how fast an axon conducts as something that adapts. Make the conduction speed itself plastic, let experience tune the delays, and phase-locking patterns reorganize accordingly. The brain, in this telling, is not just rewiring its connections. It is retiming them. So where does the field stand? It stands at a moment of methodological honesty about how little of the brain we ever actually see at once. Large-scale recordings sample a fraction at a time, different regions, different animals, different labs, often with no shared clock. And yet there's now serious effort to stitch those fragmentary, asynchronous glimpses into a single picture of directed information flow. That is a field growing up, admitting that the data are incomplete and asynchronous, and building the mathematics to cope rather than pretending otherwise. And it stands at a moment where the tools of inquiry are themselves turning reflexive. There are now systems in which language model agents advocate competing theories of cognition, each theory written as a runnable model, then design the very experiments that would tell those theories apart, run them on real people, and revise. The creative bottleneck of science, turning the accumulated failures of old models into a better one, is being automated or at least assisted. Whether that thrills you or unsettles you, It tells you the discipline has begun to study its own method as one more complex adaptive system. So here is the argument I want to build with you. First, that emergence and timing are the field's new center of gravity. That function is something networks grow into, not something we wire in. Then, that this changes what counts as an explanation and what we can even hope to measure. And finally, what it means when the scientist, too, becomes a closed loop. Let's begin where everything begins, with structure and with delay. There's a temptation, when you survey a month's worth of work in a field, to treat it as a heap. A pile of unrelated findings, each scientist tunneling away at their own private mountain, one person worrying about how the two eyes merge their signals in the visual cortex, another building a video game to study moral cooperation, a third shining infrared light at the foreheads of sleepless undergraduates. And on the surface, these have nothing to do with one another. But if you sit with them long enough, a current begins to pull beneath the noise. And the current, I'd argue, runs in one direction, away from the thing and toward the relationship between things. Let me make that concrete, because it sounds like the kind of grand abstraction that means nothing. Consider the old way of asking what a neuron does. You'd find a cell, you'd show it bars of light at various angles, and you'd declare, this neuron likes vertical edges. The neuron was a thing with a property, like a key cut for a particular lock. That picture has been quietly dissolving for years, and you can watch it dissolve in the work on what single cells in higher visual cortex actually encode. The honest answer turns out to be that their responses resist intuitive parameterization. There is no clean caption. So instead of asking what the neuron is, the more fruitful move has become asking how its activity aligns with some other space of meaning, the embedding space of a vision model, say. The neuron is no longer defined by an intrinsic label, but by a correspondence. Its identity is relational. You see precisely the same instinct in the work on brain decoding by alignment rather than complexity. The provocation in that phrase is the word complexity. For years, the assumption was that to read a thought out of brain activity, you'd need an ever more baroque model, more parameters, more nonlinearity to match the staggering intricacy of the cortex. And the finding pushes back. What matters is not how complicated your mapping is, but how well two spaces are aligned. Meaning lives in the angles between vectors, in the geometry of relationships, and once you've got the geometry right, you don't need to be clever, you need to be congruent. Now widen the lens. The self-organization work, the principle that components persist as long as their outputs are utilized by something else, is making the same claim at the level of an entire system. A part of the system has no intrinsic right to exist. It survives by serving. Its function is not a property it possesses, but a transaction it sustains with its neighbors. Stop being useful, and you are pushed toward exploration, toward becoming something else. That is the relational principle stated as a law of survival. There is no global blueprint, no central architect handing out roles. The structure precipitates out of who is talking to whom. And once you start listening for it, the same melody keeps recurring. The study of polychronous neuronal groups, those exquisitely timed firing cascades, finds that the chief determinant of how many such patterns a network can hold isn't the neurons themselves, but the clustering coefficient, the topology. Rewire the connections from a lattice toward randomness, and you lose more than 90% of the representational capacity with the very same cells. The cells did nothing. The relationships changed, and the computation collapsed. Likewise, the inquiry into how connectivity shapes what a recurrent network can compute. The structure, not the substance, sets the boundary of the possible. Even the work on conduction delays sings it. We used to treat the time it takes a signal to travel down an axon as a nuisance, a smearing imperfection. Now we find that delay itself coordinates synchronization, that adjusting myelination to tune communication timing can lock circuits into phase. The relationship between two neurons is not just whether they connect, but when the message arrives. Timing is relationship measured in milliseconds. So what is the deep current? It is a migration in where we locate the explanatory weight. The older neuroscience put it in the noun, the cell, the region, the molecule, the thing with a label. The neuroscience taking shape now puts it in the verb and the preposition, what flows between, what aligns with, what serves, what arrives when. Methods follow suit, tools that stitch together recordings from regions never observed at the same moment, reconstructing directed flow from fragments, probabilistic measures of how structural and functional modules correspond, gaze that is interesting not because it lands on an object, but because it transitions between meaningfully related ones. This is not a fashion. It is, I think, a correction toward how the brain has always actually worked. A brain is not a warehouse of labeled things. It is a vast, restless conversation, and meaning is the shape of the talking. The field is slowly learning to study the conversation rather than catalog the speakers, and that, beneath all the month's scattered noise, is the signal worth following. There's a temptation, when you've spent an hour wandering through a field as varied as this one, to reach for a tidy summary to say, here is what computational neuroscience has learned this season, and here is the lesson. I'm going to resist that, because the more interesting thing isn't any single result. It's a pattern in the shape of the questions being asked, and what that pattern implies about where the discipline is heading and what we ought to keep our eyes on. Consider what keeps surfacing across these otherwise unrelated efforts. A model of agents that persist only so long as something downstream finds their output useful, survive by serving. A study of recurrent networks where the topology, the clustering of connections, determines whether rich, time-locked firing cascades emerge at all or collapse to almost nothing. A theory of delays in signal transmission that, far from being mere noise, organize neurons into coherent oscillation. A demonstration that even confirmation bias, that old villain of rational thought, turns out, under the right accounting, to be an efficient strategy for a creature with limited memory. In each case, the move is the same. Take something that looks like a flaw, a constraint, an accident, and ask what work it might be doing. Functional relevance. That's the through line. The recurring suspicion that structure in the brain is not arbitrary scaffolding, but the visible residue of function. Now, the second-order implication of that is worth sitting with. If function shapes structure this pervasively, if you can predict representational capacity from a clustering coefficient, or recover synchronization from a conduction delay, then the project of reverse engineering the brain becomes, in principle, more tractable than the brain's bewildering complexity would suggest. You don't need to model every molecule. You need to find the constraints that matter and the functions they serve. That's an optimistic reading. The pessimistic reading is that function is a story we are very good at telling after the fact, and a system this flexible will always offer up some functional rationale for whatever it happens to do. The discipline will have to be ruthless about which it is. That's the first thing to watch, whether functional explanations make predictions that survive contact with a system that was trying to deceive them, or whether they merely accommodate what's already observed. The second thing to watch is the quiet automation of the theoretical act itself. Among these papers sits an autonomous system that doesn't just run experiments or fit models. It generates competing theories of cognition, expresses each as something executable, designs the experiment that would best tell them apart, and collects the data. The bottleneck in cognitive science was never measurement. It was the creative leap from accumulated failure to a better idea. And here is a machine making a serious bid for that leap. One ought to be careful here. The promise is enormous theory generation at a pace no human community can match. But notice the recursion. We are building computational systems to discover the principles of computational systems. The risk isn't that the machines will be wrong. It's that they'll be plausibly, productively, prolifically right in ways nobody fully understands, generating theories that work without anyone able to say why they work. The black box studying the black box. Which brings us back to that lovely tension running through the decoding work. You can align neural activity with the embedding spaces of foundation models and retrieve what someone saw, by alignment rather than by complexity. And yet the moment you ask what a single neuron is actually saying, you're back to needing a narrator, a translation layer, because the representation resists intuition. So here is what I'd hold on to. We are watching a field that increasingly believes the brain is legible, that its structure encodes its purposes, that its biases are optimizations, that its messiness is mostly economy. And simultaneously, we are building tools so capable that the legibility may pass out of human hands and into the systems we've made to read it. The third thing to watch, then, is whether interpretability keeps pace with capability, whether we can still say what we know in words a person can hold after the machines have done the discovering. The honest answer is that we don't yet know. A pilot study on insomniac students shining light at a prefrontal cortex, a single child's brainwaves under ancient chant, a graph of inflammatory markers in a rare and catastrophic seizure disorder. These sit beside grand principles of self-organization, and the gap between the messy particular and the clean general is exactly where the real work lives. What it means, in the end, is that the most important variable isn't any equation. It's our willingness to keep asking what the function actually is and to distrust the answer that comes too easily. Keep your eye on that. The signal's ahead. That's the signal for today. The noise will keep coming. We'll keep finding what's underneath it. This has been Signal Ahead with Alfred. Until next time.